Former President Trump's baseless claims about his 2020 election defeat are trickling down to the next cycle of Senate races. Here is a sampling of Republican candidates using similar rhetoric on the campaign trail.
There's no question, and it's been widely reported, that there was widespread fraud and irregularities across this country. We never had the opportunity to have common sense hearings on that, or any evidence that we could, actually see, because it was swept under the bus.
Many of us were warning about the fact that the Democrats unilaterally, fundamentally altered our voting system inside 90 days. Yeah. We warned that the state of Nevada was just simply not ready to give us a fully fair and secure election.
If I was a United States Senator on the day of the certification, I would have stood with Senator Cruz and Senator Scott and that small handful of senators who had the courage to stand up and say, wait, let's hold up on the certification of this election.
The former president is playing an active role in the upcoming 2022 midterms. He has endorsed a slate of current and potential candidates across the country, all of whom are adamant Trump supporters. Those looking to earn the former president's approval have echoed his false claims about a fraudulent 2020 election. For more, I'm joined by Cameron Joseph. He is a senior political reporter for Vice News. Cameron, welcome. How pervasive is the belief among Republican voters that the 2020 election was somehow illegitimate?
Oh, it's deeply pervasive. And while there is a strong majority of Americans who believe that the election was largely fair, and while there might have been a couple specific cases of problems that Joe Biden legitimately won the election, a majority of Republican voters disagree with that. And that's because President Trump, who remains by far the most popular politician in the Republican Party among the base, is telling them that over and over and over. And they've internalized that, and it's become the litmus test that Trump is holding candidates for 2022 by, and it's becoming the litmus test that Republican voters may hold these candidates by. And we are a long way from these primaries, but it's clearly driving the early action in a lot of these states and a lot of these key Senate races.
So you call it a litmus test here. How are you seeing this false claim of election fraud being used by candidates and potential candidates in their campaigns?
Well, it's kind of a poo-poo platter of BS, right? It kind of depends on what state you're looking at, the specific brand of what the Republican candidates are saying. And some of them are leaning really hard into this, especially in states where we're seeing active primaries. And you saw two of the Ohio candidates, Josh Mandel and Jane Timken, talking about this. It's a very crowded field, and the real goal of a lot of these candidates is who can be the Trumpiest. And we saw the two of them leaning really hard into this message that the election was stolen, there was widespread voting fraud, which there's zero evidence for, and a lot of evidence actually to dispute that. There's a reason that Trump's campaign lost in almost 100 court cases. But the underlying issue is that this isn't just in these tight primary states. We're seeing in Nevada, which should be one of the Republican Party's best chances of picking up a seat. It's a state that Biden and Hillary Clinton both won by very narrow margins. And in midterm elections generally tends to be a little more favorable for Republicans. And Adam Laxalt, who you saw at the top of that video, has really been out there very vocally supporting Donald Trump's claims that the election was stolen from him. And he's the former attorney general of the state. He has, on paper, a very good background. His grandfather was governor, a very well-known family name in the state. But he was Trump's campaign co-chairman in Nevada and filed a lot of these lawsuits, was at that Stop the Steal rally early on, right after the election in Nevada. And even after the state had certified its win, and it was clear that as we're heading into January 6th and the Electoral College was actually going to be certified by Congress, he filed just a couple of days before that a lawsuit claiming that there had been thousands of votes in the state from folks who were not from Nevada, implying that there was undocumented immigrants voting in the state. And so we saw that we're seeing this in a competitive primary to fill an open seat in Pennsylvania. The Republicans are really hoping to hold on to. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin has been one of the Republicans that's been the loudest of this. He's up for re-election. And we're seeing this really across the map in every important competitive state, including in Georgia, where Raphael Warnock won a 2-year finishing off the term of open seat beat the appointed incumbent in 2020. In 2021, actually, was the official election. And he won largely because of the base depression that Georgia Republicans believed that the election had been stolen from them. And so they weren't turning out in quite as high numbers as Democrats. Now he's facing a situation where we may see the exact same scenario play off and could possibly benefit him.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a bit more. I mean, is there evidence, you talk about Georgia, but is there evidence that former President Trump's 2020 election claims could actually dissuade people from voting in the midterms? I suppose when you look at what happened in places like Georgia, people would point to that as sort of Exhibit A.
Yeah, and I talked to a couple of Republicans who are concerned about this. Most interestingly, the head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the guy who's in charge of getting these guys elected and reelected, Senator Rick Scott from Florida, who interestingly was one of the handful of Republican senators who actually did vote against confirming all of Joe Biden's statewide victories, even after the January 6th riots. So he's an interesting character in this. And he basically said, look, I want these candidates looking forward. I want them talking about the Biden record. And in so many words, basically was like, yeah, let's try and move past this, because the implication was this probably isn't the best general election issue. And I talked to George Allen, a former senator from Virginia who ran the NRSC years ago, and he was more explicit about his concerns about this, how this could really hurt Republicans once we get to the general election, and how they really should be talking about the issues that matter most to voters day in and day out, pocketbook issues, going after the Biden agenda, areas where they really see legitimate weaknesses politically for Democrats. And the problem is Donald Trump is the one who wants to talk about this. He wants to go back to 2020 time and time again. Every rally he gives, including rallies for candidates that he's been showing up to, it's a big part of the stump speech. Every interview he gives, he's talking about this. He's starting to defend, in the last couple of interviews he's done, the actual Capitol rioters. And so this is a problem for Republican candidates who are trying to figure out a way to win in these purple states. And even in some of these red-leaning states like Ohio, where they're really hoping to win these races by appealing to moderate voters. And the polls show that in a lot of those states, most voters say that the election was relatively fair and honest, and don't really buy into these election lies that President Trump has pushed. But the problem is Donald Trump still holds the base in his hand. And if he decides to come after you, it can be a real problem. We've seen that in North Carolina, where a former governor has really gone under fire. Donald Trump endorsed a Congressman, Ted Budd, instead of Pat McCrory, who was kind of the establishment favorite in that race, partially because Ted Budd had been very vocally supportive of what Donald Trump was saying on a lot of this heading into the election, and in the certification especially. And McCrory really only came out once pretty strongly, but on his radio show was critical of the idea that the election had been stolen from President Trump, and basically saying that they needed to move on. And so that might have cost him his primary, and it certainly has made it a lot more competitive than it would have been elsewhere.
Yeah, it is going to be fascinating to see whether that messaging from former President Trump actually is the key to success for Republicans, with the former president not on the ticket himself, or if it's going to be that kind of more establishment message that you talked about earlier that actually will prove to be more effective in reaching some Republican voters. Cameron Joseph for us. Cameron, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.